Hi, Ghislaine, how are you? Okay, good. Okay, so it's 5 now. Let me open up my notes and then we can go over the concept. But we also need to talk about our project for this class. In case you have any questions, we'll go ahead and do that as well. Okay, let's share screen. Okay, so this week we are going to work with forensic and Python. We are going to use a couple of the forensic modules, and we're going to touch on logs, which is going to be part of your course project, as we need to maintain logs and manage logs in security. Let me enable live transcript real quick. So for this week, you can find the notes here and along with the assignments. And in the notes, we are going to cover chapter 12. Okay. So for this week, as I mentioned, we are going to touch on forensic analysis. The example in the book, they use a virtual machine that is used, that has Subnets infection. And in some of the script, when running with that, you have to run it against the virtual machine. And simply you can download the virtual machine and we can talk about that. So in CIS30C, we touch a little bit on volatility. And this is a framework that we can use to assess memory or disk image. So this will work with all types of systems, and that will be Windows, Mac OS, Linux, and Android. Now, depending on the versions of the Linux, you need to read their documentation to make sure that it supports the version that you're using. So in memory analysis, we basically look at information of your state or of the system state, such as applications are running, processes that would require in that application, network connectivity, any kind of open files, and so on. Now, volatility may pertain to things that will go away after you remove power. So if the system is shut off, then all of that information is flushed from the memory or from RAM. So with this particular tool, you're able to evaluate processes that are running. We can also look at network ports. We have many tools to evaluate network ports, but because we're using the ports for connectivity, also dynamic libraries, files that would pertain to the loading process or some initial process of the system. For Windows environment, we can look at registry keys and processes, and then also OS level for the kernel modules, and also memory addressing for processes as application use processes. So that will pertain to memory addresses, and then anything that will be executable. Now, in the assignment, it asks you to define the purpose for this particular framework. And it is a framework to extract data in this image, as we mentioned, that is available in RAM. To install it on the Debian Linux, you simply just use the sudo apt-get install y for yes, and you simply bring in the package, which is Volatility. Now, once you install, you can use Volatility command to be able to incorporate options where you would be able to output some details about, could be various things, network connection, your memory information, and so on. So the example in the book, it goes over how to be able to use the command and so on. So that's what we're going to touch with next, okay? And so you can find this detail also on page 1 of your notes. It talks about how volatility is used and what it is. So here you can find the information, okay? So to extract the information, we mentioned that these are some of the things, the features that it will support. And so that will be for number 2. So in number 2, it asks you what type of information you can extract using volatility, and it evaluates memory analysis. So we can look at processes, open ports, DLLs and files, registry keys, kernel modules, memory addressing by process. And process is going to use PID or PPID, which is going to be the parent process or the child process for that particular application, and then executables. Now, in Windows environment, you're going to see a lot of the processes that will pertain to executables. So when you capture the image of that system, what you can do is that image is going to incorporate all the running processes while that system is still on. So we want to capture the image and then use the image or create a copy of the image and then use that copy to do memory analysis. And so the example in the text, it uses the Subnets vmem, which is a virtual machine or an image of that system for memory analysis. Okay. So the bullets on page 1 lists the type of information that you can obtain. So here you can find that on page 1 of our notes. Now to download the Subnets ransomware VM infected system, you can download it from this particular link. When it comes down, remember that it is a zip, so you need to unzip it and then be able to use the image for analysis. And you can do it directly in terminal, or you can use the browser using Debian Linux. And then in terminal, you have to decompress, of course, that is a zip file. So the installation, the steps is listed there. Now, if we want to analyze the memory, once you install Volatility, you simply would use the command volatility. And then if you want to look at a file, then because the image is a file, so once you unzip this, you would have a file. And so you would specify that file here. Then for the image, the memory image goes there. And then for the profile, we would then need to specify the image profile and the plugin name. And in just like all the other analysis, we are going to look at specific plugins. So there will be quite a few plugins that you can incorporate with this particular package. So now for the image profile, what you can include is going to be the image profile information for the OS itself. So that will be the first thing that we evaluate. What kind of operating system is that image using? Or that image is being extracted from. So for example, if they're using Windows, right, it should display the information. So in Volatility, you can use image info to really get the operating system information. So the command would look something like this: volatility-f, and then your Subnets vmem, which is the memory image, and then your profile information. Now, if you want to add the details like this, you can, or you can simply use it like this. It's going to give you the OS. Now, what about the plugins, the last part for this? So there are quite a few plugins that you can use. You can use that device tree plugin. This is going to give you the device information or how that would be utilized on that image. So the example here, we are using volatility as a command, the file, and then this is your memory image file. And this should be a double dash, sorry, Word modified that. So the profile we can specify, and this is your Windows XP Service Pack 2. This is an x86, so 32-bit. Depending on how you want to specify, so the profile can be for that particular system. And then we can simply add the last part, which is the plugin device tree. So if you want to use the device tree plugin, you simply add the plugin name like this, okay? And so that will give you the display, and so it's going to bring in the display for your device tree. In the next part, if you're using Volatility 3, which is compatible with Python 3, you can extract processes, right, and image memory dump. So just like how you would use forensic tool at the application level, you can write the script that will be able to work with your in Python 3. So Volatility 3, if you click this right here, it takes you to the page. This is the GitHub repo, and this is mainly addressing memory extraction for Python 3. And so you would install, there are some requirements. So you need to install the dependencies. And then you want to build, you want to bring in the dependencies, download it, and then you are going to build and install it. So on the GitHub repository, they give you the requirements, which lists all the tools that you would need with it. So you want to download the text file, the requirements text file, and then use that requirement text file with your installation. So this brings it up a little bit more in the level of the installation compared to your volatility. That is not a version 3. Now to download, you would then do a git clone in Linux, and then you can use Python 3 to access the module within that package, like vol.py. And so here, what you would see is an example of how you can use Python 3 with Volatility 3, which is slightly different than what we've seen with just Volatility. But you need to install the dependency for the package, clone it, and then be able to use Python to call it. Okay. So it is a little bit different than using the command directly. So for number 3, we can say that the purpose of the device tree plugin is to run and what kind of command you use to run the plugin. So this is used to display the device tree, and that will be the same as your device tree tool. So this is a plugin that you can use, okay? And when you use Volatility, you can simply add that plugin. So the example here, I just simply used the one from the notes in the textbook. So we would use Volatility command with the file, and then your image file, and then the profile. So whatever the profile would be, could be Windows or Linux. And then you would do the device tree as a plugin at the end. So now if you are using Volatility 3, then what we can do is we can look at, the child and the parent processes for the Windows system that is for the image, okay? Now in number 4, to incorporate this, unlike the last question, because we're using Volatility 3 with Python 3, you would then use Python 3 command. And the vol.py here, that comes down from the volatility package. So when you use volatility command, it simply is using this module in Python. So just like how we would use volatility-f, you would do a vol.py-f. And then your image name, which is then, that was the one we unzipped, so subnets.vmem. And then because we're looking at Windows system processes and subprocesses, there's a plugin for PS3 or Windows PS3.ps3. This allows you to get the information for the child and the parent processes. So it's going to give you the PID for the child, which is your process ID, and then the PPID, which is the parent process ID, and it's going to list that. So very similar to what you've seen if we are looking at the task manager and the processes, but we're not actually accessing the system. We're analyzing an image file, and we're using volatility to pull some process information. And so this is how you would do that. So in Windows environment, we're able to get the process information using windows.ps3.ps3. And with this, you're able to obtain a list of your process. Okay. Any question? Okay, so coming back here, your Windows PS3 plugin, this gives you a tree view. So the parent's going to be on top, and then the child process is going to be below that. And here I also list the details. So it's going to give you the PID and the PPID. Now, in the case of the malware, as you know, Subnets is a ransomware, right? So in that, we want to evaluate the processes that were impacted or that were used by that ransomware. So you can pull that information by using the PS3. Okay, and the command is listed below that. Now, if we are looking for certificates, because certificates is normally viewed by administrator or a higher level user. If you're using Volatility 3, we have to use sudo, and in the Linux terminal, again, you are going to use Python 3. Then you're going to use the module, which is vol.py, that comes from Volatility 3-f, and then your image file. And then, unlike the last ones, instead of using PS3, we're going to use registry, windows.registry, certificates.certificates. And this allows you to evaluate certificates. And so on the certificate, it would contain information about access. It would contain some permission or even some privilege level. Certificate is also related to encryption services or encrypted services. So services that use encryption, then certificate should also provide information about that. So it's important that we know how to be able to evaluate your certificate that was issued by CA. So as we see that certificates are normally used for web-based application, as most of the web-based application uses HTTPS, then we can evaluate the certificate this way. Okay. Let me double check. Okay, so the next part is going to be on Sqlite, very similar to the network Python class. So Sqlite is a lightweight database. You can create a database using Sqlite compared to MySQL or Microsoft SQL. Sqlite is lightweight. That means that you can store the database as files. Okay, so I can have one file that would be the database. And often you would see Sqlite being used with Python for prototyping or some development testing with the database. Now, in the large scale, we can think about products that would support it, but Sqlite, Sqlite 3 would often be what you would see for testing purposes or developing database at with using Python. Now, to access Sqlite, it has a browser. And so you would use the browser to be able to navigate through the actual database content. And all relational database would start with a table. So you would see that we can use a browser to access that particular table. We can look at the columns and rows in that table or multiple columns and rows and so on. So to download the browser, you can visit this link. And the example is shown here for their screenshot, right? So you would see, so the DB browser for SQLite, they use DB4S. And this is an open source tool. So you can use this not to only view the database, but to be able to create database files. So it gives you the graphical user interface instead of having to code it. So if you need to create a database using SQLite, you can definitely use the browser. Now, you can also export table to CSV file and then do queries and so on. So if you're testing the system, right, and if it's running SQLite, you can think about how you would use the browser to be able to submit query or to look at results, or it can also give you the statistic analysis and plots, so you can analyze the data quicker. So in data analysis, this is definitely a useful part of the SQLite application to incorporate the interaction from the user to the system or the database. Okay, and so here you can look at the releases and the information on how that will be used. And so for the next question, we can describe SQLite. It is a lightweight database. And so we can use it to create a database file for our database, or sometimes you would have multiple databases. So for example, we can create a database for user accounts with their appropriate system access. We can also create database that would tie to user account and their position in the company. So we can create a table and we can link some of the columns and rows to set up a relational database. Now, the tool that we would use to access SQLite database, that will be your SQLite browser. And the link is provided on the notes. Okay. So this chapter touches on database, as we will have to investigate database, especially when you have incidents like SQL injection. You can look at how the database is set up. You can interact with the database. So if your image file would contain a database, we would then be able to evaluate that by looking at queries and so on. So the analysis aspect, depending on the nature of the database and how it's used, we can definitely do analysis with it. Okay. So now let's go into how we would use it. The version that you would see in the book describe this. So you can, in Python 3, SQLite 3 is supported. And if you look at this documentation, it talks about how you can import SQLite 3. So the first thing that you need to establish your database is to, number one, of course, use this package, but to establish connection. And you would create an object to connect to that database. And so here, after you create it, you can save it, right, as a DB file. And so this is incorporated into the actual script. So we would have a CONN, which is the object here, and it is a Sqlite 3. And it uses the connect method, and you simply state the database file name. So whatever your database file name is, right, you would then have that here. So now let's answer number 7. So we want to write the Python script, and it's not very long. We want to use the script to create Sqlite objects and use the methods to connect to the database. So let me go to my Tawny here. Okay. So the book example, this is what they use. So I wanted to run this first and show you. Okay, keep in mind that, let me go to my folder here. If you visit their site and download the code, you would see that for the Sqlite, right, there is, once you create the object, you can basically, it will create that file to represent the database. So in this script, we import Sqlite 3. And because it's handling exception, you can use Sqlite 3 database error to handle the exception. So we would import database error from Sqlite. We have a function called read from DB. And this function is going to use cursor as the parameter, or it's going to pass cursor. Because in order to access the database after you connect to it, you have to create an object called cursor. And so this object cursor is going to be using cursor method, and it's going to use the connection object to access the database, right? Database Sqlite. So then in the function, we would also use fetch all, where it's going to gather the content of the database. And again, we're going to access the cursor object here. Once it's going to look at the table using the fetch all method, we're going to print out the data. So you can use fetch all to access the content of the table and then be able to bring out the data or output the data by using print. Now for the data, because it is a container, we want to print the rows or the columns. So in this case, we're going to print the row. So we would use a for loop. For row in data, we're going to print the row, so we can see the content of our database. Now in try and accept, we're going to try to establish connection. So we have the connection object, and this is going to use the connect method from Sqlite. And then whatever your database name would be. So you just have to say database.sqlite. Then after that, you are going to create a second object called cursor. And this is going to use the cursor method with the connection object. So it's going to use cursor method to access it. Once you have the cursor object, then you can pass it. And we're going to call on the method or the function that we previously defined. So here is where we would call read from DB. Now for exception, we would handle the database error as exception, and then we will print out the error. So once you are done, you have to close the connection. Otherwise, it remains open. Okay, so we would do connection close with the finally statement. So if I run this, right, because, you know, the author had built the table for the database. So it's going to output the information from each row. Okay. Now you can definitely parse this into different lists and different files to be able to evaluate it for later purposes. So in data analysis, you will have to do that, right? We can put this into CSV where we can evaluate the columns and the rows or organize the data a little bit better as the output. So here it just showed, you know, information, who's the owner, contact, locations, and so on. So coming back to, let me open up my unit. My exercise 7, you just have to do a couple of things. Let me correct this. So first, for the first line, we're just going to import Sqlite 3. Then we're going to define the connection object, and you can name it anything you want here. Connection, CONN, like the book. So this is going to establish connection. So because it is going to be Sqlite 3 object, and it's going to use the connect method. So we would define connection, and then you can say Sqlite3.connect, and then whatever the name that you want for your Sqlite. So I'm just gonna say this, okay, because I already have one that's. So this is gonna represent the file or the database itself. So once I connect, I would then use create a second object called for cursor. You can again name it anything you want. So here we can have cursor obj, and we're going to use cursor method with the connection object. So now we're accessing that. And I wanted to print something instead of, unlike the other one, I don't want to, I might just have a blank database. So I just want to print that it is connected. So I simply use a print method there to show that it's connected. But if you want to print the data, because the content of the data is in a large container, so you want to iterate through the data by using the for loop. If you're accessing the rows, like the example in the book, or if you're looking at columns. Okay, so let me clear, and then I'm just going to run this. So it's simply going to print this. Okay, so now after you run that, when you go to the folder where your script is stored, you are going to see this file. Okay, so to really establish it, you know, if we don't have anything in it yet, we can definitely, you know, specify the type of file that would be our database by putting it in quotation mark like this. Okay, any question? So for number 7, I'm not looking for extensive script. I'm just looking for some of the basics on how we can establish the objects for connection and to access, which uses cursor method. And again, I also put that here. So with Sqlite and Sqlite 3 for Python version 3, you can also access its table. So now if I want to dive a little deeper and use the table, okay, I would use the execute method and also the fetch all. You saw that in the previous example. So here in this one, it uses SQLite. We establish the connection to the connection object. We define a function or a method. And this function is called tables in SQLite database. And we're going to pass the object, which is connection. Then in this function, because we're accessing the table, we are going to create the cursor object. And it's going to use the execute method. So here we're simply going to state a string, but you're going to use select name. And so it's like clicking on a certain part of the table. So you're going to use select, and then we want to say we're going to select name from SQLite master, and the destination, your target, is going to be table, because we're using the table and we're going to access the content of that table. Now, table is going to be, the tables is going to be in a list. And so we are going to go through the item, right? So for V in cursor fetch all, so it's going to find all the content, just like what you've seen in the rows before. And if your first item for V, right, if your index is not SQLite sequence, then we are going to continue. So for cursor close, we want to exit out of that. We're going to return the tables. Okay, so it's going to give us the content of the list as tables. And then we are going to use, we're going to call on the function and its parameter. And we're going to store it back into tables here. Then we're going to use the remove method. We're going to remove the order for the column. And then after that, right, we define cursor connection using cursor method. Because it is a table, we have to implement a for loop. So we're going to select, and you want this to be using the dot format table. Okay, then we're going to pass this object into the execute method so that way we can access it. Okay, and then we're going to pull all the content by using fetch all, and we're going to print out. So using this, we're going to parse it into string or records, so that way we can see it in text for each of the element. Then we're going to close our connection. So when you run this, okay, it is showing you here that it is accessing employee, and employee has 9 elements. It's like the content, so it counts up the elements in the column, category, 8 elements, and so on. And then as you go down, you would see that for our table, we would be able to view how many elements in that column. Now, on the security side, can someone run the script to be able to assess your database like this? Yes, right? And so can you. If you're using a database like from SQLite, then we can run the script to evaluate what kind of things it might be, passwords, username, and so on. And we have an idea of how many items are listed in specific columns for the table. Okay, and you saw how the rows are. So this is how we can get a summary of our table. Now we can also look at database schema, which is we can use the table schema. And similar to the last one, what you can see is, of course, we have to have a connection object, right? And we also have to have a cursor. And in our cursor, similarly, you are going to see that we're using select, and then we are going to state. But for the name, instead of the name, we are going to pass the question mark here. And then for the table name, we're going to put it into the list. And table name, it's going to store the input of the user. They're going to enter it. And so if we're doing this, it's basically to create, right, a new table where the user would enter that table. So that's the point in showing this. Yes, you can have a static table to be able to view its schema, or you can have it created. So at this point, it's going to create a file. It's going to wait for the user to enter the table information. It's going to store that, and then it's going to access that to be able to give you the content. So let me clear this. And then if I run this, so let's say we would have HR for our table, right? Now, since it's not listed, right? So here it's going to do a trace back where it say, oh, I don't understand what that is with the existing table. Okay. And so it's going to handle the error and it's going to show you that. Now, if we go with the schema from what their database would be, like for restaurants and order, right, it would be able to provide that. Okay. So if you're using SQL, and so for SQLite, the examples are listed here. You can also get some of the code. So if you want to run that, okay. And for the schema. So there's just a subsection in the chapter that talks about SQLite. Next, we're going to talk about PCap. Do you have any questions regarding database? Okay. So PCap, similar to what you've seen in Wireshark. And so when you install Wireshark, right, it would ask you to install PCap file or NCAP, right? That basically is for capture. So this tool is used to visualize your network diagrams or the devices that are connecting in your network and their traffic. It graphically provides the traffic capture. Okay, so that means that you have to have the dependencies or the libraries and the packages installed. So it uses I forgot the T here, tk-enter, which is used as a library or a module for Python for buttons and components for the graphical user interface. GraphViz allows you to map, or it would establish the map for your network diagrams, how systems are connected. PIL allows you to use this for imaging purposes on the graphic side, and then image TK, which also is related to graphics. So the graphic libraries and package needs to be installed. So when you do this, of course, you can put it on a requirements.txt file and then be able to install it, or you can do it in a couple of commands. So we're going to install Python 3 with TK, and tk-enter comes with Python 3. We are going to install GraphViz. We're also going to install PIL. Now, some Linux machines or Linux OSs comes with PIL. If you're using like Raspberry Pi or a Debian release that doesn't have PIL, you have to install it. And how do you know when PIL is not installed, right? If you're using graphics like animated graphics and it's not moving, likely that PIL is not installed, right? So for example, if I embed a GIF on my graphical user interface and it's not having any movement, that means that PIL is missing, okay? And on their documentation, for a lot of the graphic type of libraries. They even mentioned that. So we need to get pill and pill image TK. So those are the dependencies that's required for PCapXray to run. Okay. And you can look at the repo information for PCapXray. So it would look something like this, right? After you install and run it, so it has the graphical user interface. You need to put in the file path, okay, where it's going to be able to obtain the file or where it's going to output the file. So when it captured the traffic, we can put it in the location so you can browse to that. And so here, when you click analyze, it's going to look at your web traffic, your Tor traffic, malicious traffic, device traffic. So it gives you the overall. So Wireshark is a good tool, and it's basically a sniffer, sniff out all traffic. But for this, right, we can specify the type of traffic and also source and destination. Okay. And when it outputs for the map, it will look like this. And this is where Graphviz comes in. So it will be able to give you the overall visual of how your network would be. Now, this is used in forensic because in some case we have to analyze for forensic matters network activities. So there are quite a few tools that we can use. So PCapXray is one of them. Okay. So if you do the setup, you can follow this instruction or the one in the book. Okay. And it also works with Mac. They also include the video on how you would be able to use it. Now, if you already have a capture, right, you can definitely browse to it and like what the video shows. And so on the right, you will be able to access the 2D image of it. So you can zoom in or you can go to a certain section of the actual network diagram, which is nice. I think a lot of the scanners that's open source, it doesn't have the graphical component. So this is one that does it. Okay. All right, so let's answer the next part. So for PCAP, it is a tool. You can use it to visualize network diagram and through your network traffic capture. So we have to capture to be able to visualize it. So you can definitely capture in an application and save it as a PCAP file and then be able to analyze it. Okay. And then I think all sniffer allows you to have different file format for the capture. And so all sniffer should support PCAP. And you can also hone in on a certain type of traffic, or you can evaluate all. To install, we can write these two commands. Okay, pill, Graphviz, and TK. Any question? You can find this information on the notes as well. Okay, so PCapXray is definitely a useful tool for our network forensic investigation. And you can also see more example here, right? For Windows Registry, Windows Registry contains configured information for our system, software, and hardware level. And so registry sometimes can be tampered with, or in the case of if we're investigating we want to look at some of the things that would relate to application configuration, we can go to your HQ local machine. Or it could relate to security, where we would go to security or SAM agent. Okay. So these are some of the top entry for registries. So you often would go to system for your system 32 configuration, SAM, security. If you want to look at application, that will be under software, user profile, or the default. And there are more, but these are the top 6. So in Python, when we are analyzing Windows registry or doing investigation on Windows registry, we can use Python-registry module. This allows you to access Windows registry to find information or evidence. So to use it, we would clone it. The repository is listed there, and it's python-registry.git. After you clone it, just like our last lab, you have to change the directory to Python registry. And then with that, we would then be able to run the setup for the install. Using this module, you will find that there are built-in methods for the module. It's going to give you timestamp, which is recorded for each of the record in the registry, name, path, parent, subkeys, values, and so on. So when you reconfigure your system, the values are changed to that particular record on the Windows registry, as Windows registry is a database. Okay. So here are your registry key methods, and then for your registry, your register value, it would use name, value type, string, value type, and then value. So this would give you value information that was set for the registry record. You can also use Ripper. And when you visit this, again, you would download the zip file and then you gotta unpack. So there are tools also and plugins that were created for registry reader. Okay, so basically you're gonna look at the content of the registry database. So for 9, we can say that in Python, the module that we're going to use for Windows registry access is going to be Python-registry. When we do the installation, like the text has mentioned, or the documentation, we would do a git clone and pull that from the GitHub repository. We would then, after we clone it, we would change the directory and then access that directory to do the installation. There are additional modules that you can use. Instead of using Python registry, you can use WinRegistry or WinReg, right? And they are different than your Python registry, but they can be used to accomplish the same thing. So you don't have to use Python registry. However, right, there are variants in how you would incorporate WinRegistry and WinReg in your Python module in some cases. Okay. So where did I get number 10? You can find this information on the notes. Okay. Now, if you look at the Python script on how your Windows registry script is written, right? Because it is a system information that you're accessing, you simply just use the sys module. And then we're going to import in registry. From registry, we're going to create an object called reg. It is registry object. Okay. Now we're going to analyze software in Windows registry. So we'll print that out. We're going to use try and accept. Here we're going to use the open method. We're going to open and identify the Microsoft Windows version. Then we can look at the timestamp, and we would use the for loop to access the value keys because it is a dictionary. So here we would look at your key and then the value name, the value path is going to be value. So we would use the method from the module to be able to access, right, value.name as you see in the list and value.value. So the second part is just the exception handling. Now, if I write this as a Python file, right, I can use Python-3 command to run the script, but you have to put in the registry software path. And the example would be like this. We would run that script, and then we would say this would be where it would be for in the registry. So that way it can go and be able to get the software configuration information. Okay. So a little bit different when you're using Python module to analyze registry information. So in the next example, it shows you, more details like the service pack of the Windows, product ID, product name, and so on. Okay, so that's slightly different than the last example. So if we want to obtain, we want to use the script to get the OS detail, we simply use Python-3 to run the script right after we save it. And then we would specify again the path of your registry. Now, if we look at the two module that's different than Python registry, here is your Win registry. This is the lightweight registry example or a library, and it shows you examples. So we would do the install and then we can use it. Okay, so you can definitely use it to update your registry or change it or edit it, right? As we would see in Windows environment, we would use WinRegEdit. And or we can write a script to automate that. Okay, so because in the case where if you have to edit 1,000 systems, it would not make sense to do them individually, right? We would write the script and then we would specify the target system, and then we would incorporate what we want to change on each. Any question? Okay. So now if we look at the second one, which is WinReg, and so this allows you to use Windows Registry API with Python. So it's slightly different where you can incorporate API in this one. And it's able to handle the object and the close on the object handling and then access it and then close it because it is a database. So here you do have different type of method, right? How it would use to connect the registry. So earlier we saw that in the database, we would say connect, right? On this one, they write it connect registry, and then you would specify your computer name and your key. So with different module, you have options in how you can integrate Python in Windows registry evaluation. Okay. So that's where the 2 additional modules for Windows registry come from. All right. So now let's come back here. For the third part in the chapter, which is going to be on logging. So logs is a crucial area of cybersecurity. As we look at logs to respond to events, we would look at logs to audit security. There are endless amount of things that we can find from our logs, right? We can build some information about our system health and performance from logs, and also security level from logs. And so with that, Python has the logging module. This is the module. I forgot to bold this. Okay. And you can find the documentation here. So if you look at the tutorial, it shows you how, and also use the cookbook. So we'll spend a little bit on this when we do the lab this week. Okay. So you can definitely write a Python script for logging. Now, if you go to the basic here, it shows you how you can set up, right, some of the methods. So debug, info, warning, error, and critical. Those are the categories that you would see in your normal event logs. And then also you can use like different level, debug, info, warning, and so on. So if I want to just set up a warning as the message in string, right? I import in logging. I would use the warning method and then pass the string in it. Okay, and we can simply use logging.warning and then add the string in the parameter. If we want to show information, right, we would then do something similar but using info method. So when you run it, right, you would see watch out as that string was passed and so on. If you want to log to a file, you would use basic config. And the book talks about that as well. Then you would define what your file name would be, right? Sometimes we would want to specify the type of log file that we want to save. Then we also need to encode it. And then we can include the debug. For the debug, we can specify the message that we want to disclose, info, warning, and an error. So as you can see, a lot of these are using string. So we can specify the information because ultimately logs allows us to see everything in text, right? So coming back here, we can say that the features in logging and any form of logging, you would see that it would have debugging feature. This is where your code is examined and it would search for bugs and errors. For IT forensic analysis, we would identify the incidents, the events, attacks, and so on. For the audit is after the fact, so we can look at some of the actions or the event that occurred that might cause security concerns. So IT audit is when we look at the logs for audit. So for logging level, again, we have these categories: debug, warning, error, and critical. So in debug, it would just give you the bug details. The warning, it would then, if something unexpected happening, it would show that. Error, that will be just handling error for the applications or the condition for the application with error. And then for critical, that's a fatal error. So when we look at the logs, we would then address this first, right? And then this, and then this and info is going to be last. Okay, because that's just information. For your components, you would have 3 areas: logger, handler, and formatter. The logger is the record of actions of the event. The handler is going to be how the interface going to handle the instance. So logging acts up on instances as log records. So there are different types of handler that you can use to be able to communicate for the same logger, right? Formatter allows you to access the instance in the application code. All right, let's take a look at some example. So let's do this one first. Okay, so if I want to do the log to a file, you saw this in the text already, right? We would import logging. We would use logging.basicconfig. This is going to allow you to create the log file and add the details of the logs onto that file. Then you would say file name and then whatever that log file is. And then we want to do a debug level. For the debug, we can have it send out the message, the info message, and the warning message for each. Okay, so that's at the simplest. Now, if you want to do the message handling, that can go a little further, where we would incorporate formatter. And this is going to allow you to make the log files cleaner. Okay. So here we would have logging module. And then we would create the logger, and your object is going to be get logger object. I'm going to plug in my laptop here for a second. And we are going to set level for debug. So unlike the last example where the debug was added, so you can definitely use it as part of the file handler, or you can define it separately like this. Okay. So for your project, you are expected to create logs for your HTTP server. So we have to know how to write these scripts. Then we are going to use the file handler. And in this one, we're going to use the formatter, which is here we create a formatter object. We're going to have it format for the timestamp, name, level, and message. Okay. And here, after you have the formatter, you are going to use the set formatter method, and we're going to pass that object. Then on the next part, we're going to add handler, and we're going to pass the file handler. So that's where it's going to create the debug.log. And then for the debug, the info, the warning, and the error, and the critical, we simply just output the message. So when you run this, right, it's just going to generate the file debug.log, and you can use that for evaluation. So for 11, we can say that the module that we're using is going to be logging module for Python programming to generate logs and manage log. The features, we can use it for debugging, forensic analysis, and audit. You don't have to state all of the details, but again, this is in your notes. So now you can use logs for monitoring. We all know that, right? To look at events that could possibly be anomaly. We can go back and investigate something that happened as an incident, so we can do forensic. And then we can use it to track errors and bugs. So to really simply create a log file like mylog.log using logging module, it's really easy, right? Let me move this down a little bit. So we can import log or import logging. Then we're going to use basic config method. And all you have to do is use that method to specify your file name. That will be mylog.log and put it in quotation mark. And then the level, we can include it all into basic config. So if you don't use basic config, you have to define the object separately for file handler, formatter, and so on, like what you've seen in the last example. And then for the debug, the info, and the warning, right, we can include the message that we want to output as string. Now, can we go a little bit further by incorporating formatter? Yes, you can definitely do that. So this is at the basic level where you would have debug info and warning. We did include the critical one on this, so you can definitely use the critical method to also output some message there. Any question? So I want to run this so you can see. Oh, let me reopen that. Okay. And so when we run this, right, it's just going to generate that. And then when I go here, it's showing my log here. And then that will be the message for, so here it puts debug info and warning. So as you can see, that generates that file, okay, which is here. So for the project, you can at least, right, I would add a little bit more to this and make it a little bit full-fledged log, right? And then even if you want to have it automated, you can write a script to automate it. You know, as long as the system is running, so we can put in the conditions where for your, this is the target server, and then you can have it running and generate the logs for all its occurrences. So you can use logs to track things. And so for 12, we can refer to the example in the textbook, right? Or from their website, which is their documentation. And then you can even write it. Okay, so there's some examples. You can run it in shell, you can write the script and then run the script. There's some example on, we talked about how message handling using the handler and the formatter. Now, if you want to do the configuration file, and this is important, so we can set up a configuration file for your logs. Okay. Logging config. So here we're going to import in logging config. And we're going to use the file config to create a logging config file. And then for the get logger method, we're going to use root. And again, we can implement debug and info. So the difference in this is that you are using the configuration file here for your log, right? And so that will be your log configuration. So, and your code example is there. Okay. Now, you can also dive through the documentation, like it shows you how you can use it to display date, time, and messages, modifying the format. Okay, if you are logging from multiple modules, in the case of the project, you can also take a look at that. They have some decent examples. So if you want to access the cookbook, right, it shows you how you can incorporate the various module, looking at threads and so on for logging. So the applications that have logging mechanism, right, you can definitely see that we can use a library and be able to incorporate the methods from that library to output messages as related to errors or warning and so on. We can also track those things and record those things into a file. Okay, so in the lab this week, I will spend a little bit more time on this so that way you know how to incorporate it as just to run the basic example, which only gives you like the output text. Any question regarding assignment in the chapter? Chapter is pretty short. If you have the text, you can go through it and take a look closer at some of the example and the explanation for those example. I did include the code on the script. Okay. I mean, include the code on the notes. I mean. Okay. So next, I want to talk a little bit about the project. And so you have 4 weeks to accomplish this. And I think a lot of the exercises that we've done and the notes and already gave you a big chunk of it since day 1. Okay. So part 1 is going to be 200 points. And in part 1, you are expected to do a few things. Now, you can separate them as scripts that will probably be more ideal, right? Where you would put things into a package and you can build it as a Python package where you can have modules using other modules, or you can keep them as separate scripts. So here for A, you are to assess the vulnerability of the HTTP server. And that is pretty widely stated, right? We need to take a look at ports and the services that's enabled on that server. So first you have to enable the HTTP server. We did a lab on that. And then we would write the script to assess its ports, its connectivity, right? Header and response, request and response headers, and many things. So I will leave it up to you on how you want to assess its vulnerability. And some of this will lend itself into the second part. So that will be 50 points. You must incorporate module packages and or APIs. Okay. The second part, we want to make it a monitoring script where it's going to look at connectivity and security. And I think in the last few weeks, we addressed how we would evaluate security for our web services. So you have to really think about beyond the port and the connection. You can look at protocols. Even for this part, you can also look at your request and reply and so on. Okay, so these two should go together. Then for the third item, you are going to create a script for logs. And the logs needs to store information, warnings, and errors. That will be 50 points. In the second part of this, I want you to, once you have your script, I want you to just test it. It could be on your virtual machine as a local system that's running HTTP services, or, you know, yeah, you're going to have to test on the local system. So we're going to do at least 3 screen capture for the test of your script. So I wanted to see how you're able to implement your script for the test. So you just run those modules. Then I want you to briefly describe, right, as analysis on the actual server communication, connectivity, and so on. So in this project, you are achieving your pen testing for web server, okay, through Python scripts. And that's what you want to achieve. So looking at your logs, looking at the activities that's happening, right? You would be able to evaluate how secure is that HTTP server. So altogether combined, that will be 200 points. I did put the rubric on the actual project. So let me come back here. You can find the project module on the bottom. Okay, so part 1, you will find a document that state all the details there, just like what I've gone over. And then for the rubric, I just broke that down to each of the scoring items. Then when you submit, I just need to put it into a zip folder. All your module, your Python files, and your summary of your analysis goes into a zip folder. You can upload it. Okay. Now, like all the other classes for the part 2, you are going to evaluate the outcome of your project. So you just simply use the Google form, fill out your feedback, take a screenshot so you can put it onto a document or upload it separately. Oh, I put, let me fix this real quick. I caught an error here. And then second, just upload your scripts onto a GitHub repo and then add your document. You can copy and paste your code up there, or you can just upload the file. Should be easy. Okay. I also put link for how to use GitHub. And if you need help, let me know. I'm sure you did it for other classes already. All right. So the project only have 2 parts. And I recommend that you would begin working on it, and we will address the logging part this week. Okay, so only you and I today. Some of the others, they might be tied up doing other things, but hopefully they'll be able to watch the video and go through the questions and the notes. Okay, so for our lab this week, we're going to do a couple of things to really address the objective of the lesson, right? The main focus is also going to be using this and also logs. Okay. So I will open the lab maybe tomorrow or Wednesday morning. So that way we will go over the lab together. Okay. Any questions? Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing, stop recording.